We'll continue to stick with the same learning objectives, and our practice this time is saturated buffers. This also gives us a touch point back with the NRCS Conservation Practice Standards. A normal riparian buffer or a grass or woody buffer along a stream provides a lot of great benefits. It provides wildlife habitat, it can help stabilize the stream bank, it can prevent sediment from getting into the stream. The challenge with a great buffer like this from a nitrogen loss perspective is that a tile drain or a subsurface drain cuts straight through the soil underneath this really great buffer area. And so the tile drainage water doesn't have anything to do with all of the other good things going on inside the buffer and going on inside the soil. A saturated buffer is a twist on a normal grass or vegetated buffer where we reroute the tile drainage water underground to flow as shallow groundwater through the buffer's soil. This is a modification of the edge of field drainage system. This practice returns the tile drainage water back into shallow groundwater so that it can flow through the soil itself via natural gradients to the stream, returning to the stream as base flow. By flowing through the soil rather than through a pipe, we begin to reap all the good benefits of all those good microbes in the buffer soil. So how does a saturated buffer actually reduce in-loss in drainage? As water moves through the buffer soil, nitrate is denitrified, plants uptake the water and the nitrogen, and flow is reduced slightly. Current research suggests that denitrification actually accounts for most of the nitrogen loss reduction that this practice provides rather than plant uptake. Let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of this practice. First of all, the components basically include a control structure and a distribution tile. This is easy when you're trying to itemize parts. For example, when you're doing a cost comparison, because there are very few actual parts and pieces. So this practice is relatively simple in terms of that respect. At this site, for example, this is one of the saturated buffers that my group monitors. Flow comes from the field underground from the left of the screen, so the field's outside of the picture on the left. The flow runs into the stop logs that are in that control structure in the middle of the picture. And those stop logs stop the water and then route or force direct the water to the sides. There's two lateral distribution pipes that happen to come out of this control structure, one on each side. And those distribution tiles are perforated drain pipe. You'll recall that perforated drain pipe has small holes in it. That's opposed to solid drain pipe that doesn't have holes in it. And those perforations or those holes are how the subsurface drainage water gets reconverted back into shallow groundwater. The water flows down those distribution laterals and out through the perforations and then just rejoins the natural shallow groundwater right there in the riparian area. And the water flows along the natural gradient towards the stream underground. During high flow events, or times when there's a lot of drainage water leaving the field, a portion of the water will overtop the stop logs inside that control structure, and this portion of the water goes straight to the stream. This is important because this allows us to really minimize the amount of water that we're backing up into the field. One note about the name, saturated buffer. A good colleague, a stakeholder in the state pointed this out to me. The name saturated buffer kind of implies that you might have a saturated buffer and walk out on there and you would be kind of like a bog, or it would be very like squeak, 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 squeak. You're not saturating the buffer all the way up to the surface like that. And if you do that, in fact, you're not really doing the practice right. We're not creating boggy areas. We're just trying to resaturate some of the subsoil. I love the relative simplicity of saturated buffers, but there are some important considerations or kind of limitations for siting where saturated buffers can go. Obviously, you have to either have a buffer or you have to be willing to put a buffer in. This means that you can't farm straight up to the stream bank if you want to do a saturated buffer. In fact, the minimum buffer width to do this practice needs to be at least 30 feet wide for your buffer width. And as a related note, very new research that's come out within the past year has shown that saturated buffers that are put into existing buffers, areas that have been buffers for more than a couple years, actually work better than if you put a brand new buffer in and then immediately make it a saturated buffer. So this is a good example of a practice that actually works better if you retrofit something that you already have existing. There's some important soil characteristics that you need if you want to have a saturated buffer. You need in your soil a restrictive layer, so like a tight clay layer somewhere along the soil profile, because remember you're going to try to encourage denitrification to happen within the buffer's soil. And so for that you need an anaerobic zone to develop, which means it's helpful to have a real tight restrictive layer so that you get kind of a perched water table, so that you allow conditions for denitrification to develop. On a similar vein, you don't want a layer of gravel or sand in your soil substratum. You don't want any layer of high permeability, because when water hits that, it's going to shoot straight out to the creek, and you want water to stay in the buffer soil long enough for those denitrifiers to do their job. You also obviously want a soil with a good amount of organic carbon, because that's the food for the denitrifiers. We typically don't have a problem with not having enough organic carbon here in Illinois, but that is something to consider. Lastly, there's some considerations for the bank itself. You don't want a stream bank or a ditch bank that's erodible or that might easily slough off. Remember, you're going to be moving more water actually through the soil, pushing water through the soil out to the stream, so you need a good stable bank. And just for context, here is our NRCS Conservation Practice Standard Code 604 for saturated buffers. Some of the things we just discussed are in here, like avoiding layers of high permeability, wanting to have enough organic carbon or organic matter in the soil for those denitrifying bacteria. There's a couple other good siting requirements discussed in the Purdue University fact sheet. That's a part of your required reading. That fact sheet does a good job of discussing some of the landscape positioning requirements that you need to have a saturated buffer. One of the challenges for getting exact in-loss reduction values, like a % in-loss reduction for saturated buffers, is that we often have to assume that all of the nitrate that gets routed into the buffer through that distribution line gets denitrified in the buffer zone. And you would monitor this with monitoring wells that you would install along transects along the flow path of that water between the distribution tile and the stream. This tends to be a pretty good assumption, but it is still just that. It's an assumption. It's relatively easy to monitor how much water gets diverted into the buffer with our flow monitoring, and it's relatively easy to estimate how much water bypasses straight to the creek, also with flow monitoring. That's relatively easy and relatively cheap. And by assuming all the nitrate that gets diverted into the buffer itself gets denitrified, you can estimate the nitrogen loss reduction simply from the percentage of water that was routed into the buffer. For example, on an annual basis, if you route 60% of your flow from the field into the buffer, that means 40% of the water has bypassed. If you also make the assumption that all of the nitrogen that gets routed into the buffer gets denitrified, then that would be 60% times 100%, which is 60% in loss reduction. The longer the saturated buffer distribution tile or distribution pipe, the more water you can infiltrate into the buffer, which increases nitrogen removal. So in theory, if you had a long enough buffer, you could completely eliminate any bypass. But in reality, the length of the buffer is limited by site conditions and by the infiltration capacity of the soil, or how quickly the soil can accept that water. Within the past 10 years, there was a really great large regional effort to install saturated buffers across the Midwest. And these were about 10 years ago, the first saturated buffers to be installed. There was about 15 installed, and those sites averaged about 20 to 25% nitrogen loss reduction. Now those were the first saturated buffers to be installed, so some of the sites weren't really ideal. And researchers across the Midwest learned a lot from those first installations of like what not to do. A more recent report from Iowa that came out within the past year, from 17 site years of saturated buffer performance in Iowa, showed that they were treating about 50% of the water on an annual basis from those sites, and they were removing the vast majority, 85 to 95% of the nitrogen that was routed into the buffer. And so taken together, that 50% times about 90%, the ultimate in-load reduction or in-loss reduction that they estimated was 40%. In the Chesapeake Bay watershed, we've recommended a 20% in-load reduction for saturated buffers, which is conservative, but again, this is a fairly new practice, especially in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Because this is a new practice, most of the research, like I'm saying, has been done on this practice since the state strategies have come out. For that reason, this practice of saturated buffers is not a recommended practice in the Illinois nutrient loss reduction strategy, because there wasn't enough research when the strategy was being developed for us to include this practice. However, this practice of saturated buffers is a great example of how the nutrient strategies are intended to be living documents. For example, the state of Iowa has since updated their strategy to include the practice of saturated buffers, and they rate this practice at about 50% nitrogen loss reduction. We'll wrap up with some of the challenges and benefits. Saturated buffers are a relatively low cost practice, in my opinion, generally running about $2,000 to $3,000, maybe $3,500, but obviously that varies with the length of the saturated buffer and accordingly with the drainage area that you're trying to treat. There aren't very many parts. It's a relatively low maintenance practice. This can actually be a set it and forget it type practice. So you would install it, and then there's not a lot of management or maintenance that has to be done. With a control structure life of relatively 10 to 15 years, you'd be good for 10 to 15 years. You would just maintain your buffer like you would any buffer. If your buffer happens to be in a federal conservation program like the Conservation Reserve Program, there's requirements that you have to meet in terms of maintenance for those types of buffers. But basically, you really could set that control structure and leave it in place, just checking on it a couple times a year. Other than the siting restrictions that we talked about a second ago, there's very little challenges or barriers for this practice. It's really a very easy practice, but again, you have to be willing to have a buffer and not farm right up to the edge of the creek. Lastly, I'll mention, if you like pictures and want to see some pictures of saturated buffer installations, there's a great Flickr account where you can scroll through a bunch of pictures of great looking saturated buffers being installed in Iowa. See you next time.